Friends, good evening to you in Africa and Europe, and greetings also to those who may be joining this webinar from other locations. On behalf of the Council for World Mission, I warmly welcome you to this webinar. Kindly note, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. As we welcome all of you in tonight's webinar, we have posed a couple of poll questions on your screen, and we ask that you take a few seconds to answer these. You're joining us for the third and final day of the eDARE webinars for the Africa and Europe regions. We continue to reflect on the challenges and opportunities of the COVID-19 pandemic for the way we live, work, think, communicate, worship, and engage in our God talk. COVID-19 is deadly. There is no doubt about that. As we have been reminded, it is also more of a revealer. It is not the only pandemic before us. What is the moment and the opportunity before us? Maybe a question we can contemplate on. Where and how will we partner in the unbinding of much that continue to shackle us? What new language and content may we rediscover, reclaim, to give life flourishing shapes to solidarity, to bodies, to healing, to theodicy, to interpretive tools, to rituals, to faith and faithfulness. This evening, our presenters will help us to continue wrestling with these and other related questions in our response to the pandemic. Wanda Dijveld is Professor of Religion, Religious Department, Luther College, Decorah, Iowa, USA. Tiniko Maluleke is Professor with the Faculty of Theology and Center for the Advancement of Scholarship, University of Pretoria, South Africa. Anthony Reddy is Extraordinary Professor, Theological Ethics, University of South Africa, and Director of the Oxford Center for Religion and Culture, Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, UK. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us and for your willingness to participate in this conversation. But before we listen to our colleagues, we would hear a pre-recorded message from the General Secretary of the Council for World Mission, the Reverend Dr. Colin Cowan.
Dear sisters and brothers, I am Colin Cowan, the General Secretary of the Council for World Mission, and it is my pleasure and delight to welcome you to eDARE 2020. This has been a difficult year for all of us. The coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic has done its worst, created untold pain and suffering and dislocation for people all over the world. Over 1 million of our people have died around the world, and millions more have been infected by the coronavirus. And at the moment, there is wide-scale disruption, uncertainty, fear, and insecurity among so many of our people. We mourn the loss of our sisters and brothers around the world. We feel the pain of the many who are infected and isolated from family and friends. And we struggle with what it means to remain faithful to the gospel of Christ in these times. We struggle with what it means to speak faith into disruptive situations. We struggle to understand what it means to talk about a God who is sovereign and a God who is present. And yet it is in moments like these that we must wrestle with our faith and to ask, where is God in the midst of all that is going on? And that's what eDARE is about. It is a theological reflection on the COVID-19 pandemic, to reflect on the inequalities that we see, to reflect on the broken healthcare system that we are experiencing, to reflect on the incapacity of governments worldwide to come together and to collaborate on a way forward, to reflect on the irresponsible behavior of so many of our leaders and our people, and to ask what kind of future awaits us and how might we participate in the unfolding of God's future. I invite you to join us to share your own reflections. There's a group of theologians, church leaders, social activists who have spent quality time to prepare for these webinars. And I trust that as they present, we will engage with them. And I trust that as they present, we will engage with them. And we will gain clarity as to what matters most in these moments. That we would hold on to that which underscore our values and that which speaks to life that is flourishing. I invite us to share fully in these times, but to take away from every session insights that will help you in your further reflection, contemplation, and preparation to participate in God's unfolding future. This may be a difficult time, but it is not the end of the world. And in fact, it opens up immense opportunities for us to rethink a broken world and to ask, what is God saying to us in these moments? So welcome, and let us share together. God bless.
We shall now move into our discussion session, and we would be listening to our panelists. And first up in the presentation would be Wanda, who would be speaking on blame the victim when systemic injustice ceases to be a culprit. Wanda is present with us, but she has opted for a recorded video of her presentation, which we would listen now. And her presentation will be followed by Tinico's paper. So we first listen to the presentation by Wanda.
Hello, I'm Wanda Deifelt, and I'm going to talk about blaming the victim when systemic injustice ceases to be a culprit. One day, when Jesus was walking along with his disciples, they saw a man who had been blind since birth. The disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The Gospel of John gives us a glimpse of what goes on in the mind of many. The disciples are known for playing the role of the average person, but in doing so, they also offer an opening for a teaching moment when Jesus broadens the horizon of his students and makes them think and act differently. I wonder what this scene would look like today. What would be the reaction of the disciples to the 2020 pandemic? Instead of walking along, Jesus and his disciples would need to wear face masks and keep physical distance and probably interact via Zoom. And they might ask, what did the 40 million people who contracted COVID-19 and over a million people who died from it do to deserve this misfortune? Who sinned? This analogy might seem frivolous or even outrageous. Who would think of blaming anybody struggling to breathe, wired to a respirator, or in complete isolation? It would be simpler to dismiss the comparison altogether, but ironically, this is not far from our reality. The way political authorities and public spokespersons have treated the pandemic, urging businesses to stay open and compelling children to go back to school while seeing millions of people who get sick and die as casualties, is exactly what blaming the victim looks like. This is evidenced in the following CNN interview that I quote. The United States organized response to the pandemic has been historic, Trump's Health Secretary Alex Azar told CNN on May 17. But America, unfortunately, has a very diverse population, and Black Americans and minorities in particular have significant underlying disease. Jack Taper, the CNN anchor interviewing Azar, paused and squinted. Surely, he asked, Azar was not arguing that the reason that there were so many dead Americans is because we are unhealthier than the rest of the world. Azar doubled down. These are demonstrated facts. That doesn't mean it's the fault of the American people that the government failed to take adequate steps in February, Tapper said. This is not about fault. It's about simple epidemiology, Azar said. Adding in a pious tone, one doesn't blame an individual for their health condition. That would be absurd. End of quote. But this is exactly what is happening. In an attempt to exempt the US government and current administration on the staggering number of COVID contamination and deaths, the Machiavellian solution is exactly that of faulting people for their health condition. This rhetoric blames Black Americans for dying from a novel virus because they had diabetes or high blood pressure, in the same way it uses prior conditions to justify access to health care. In other words, it is easier to find fault with somebody's action than to extend sympathy and show solidarity. This attitude first dawned on me during the HIV and AIDS pandemics. From the outset, it was labeled a disease for people at risk because of their risky behavior. Then, too, the first question asked was, when somebody was found out to be HIV positive, how did they get it? And the answer to this question depended on whether a person merited empathy or simply a shrug of shoulders. This indifference is at the heart of the COVID-19 pandemics as well. Well-being is seen as a merit and access to health, whether admission to a hospital, medical care, healthy eating habits, physical exercise, and manageable stress levels is a reward, not a prerequisite. In countries such as the United States or Brazil, where I'm from, we are taught that collective efforts are subversive, labeled as communist or socialist, and individuals are left to fend for ourselves. We become used to tackling every problem through the lens of individual rights or personal privilege. And this disempowers the common good and any collective response to a pandemic, whether it is COVID-19, racism, sexism, or climate change. One of the mechanisms for the perpetuation of these challenges is precisely the notion that individual solutions are the answer for collective problems. This makes it possible to blame victims and leave political figures off the hook. Health is a merit and illness is blameworthy. In some cases, such as the argument employed by the Brazilian president to address COVID-19, was placed in opposition to the welfare of the economy, with a willingness to sacrifice human lives to safeguard jobs. Last month, Bolsonaro addressed the United Nations. His statement offers a glimpse on the opportunistic politicization of the virus. It conflates criticism to public policies with religious persecution and exempts the greatest beneficiaries of social and economic inequalities of their public responsibility. According to this logic, not only have the ill and dead because of COVID-19 brought this upon themselves because of their weakness, for the physically fit and masculine, which Bolsonaro claims to be, a pandemic-causing virus should be treated as a common cold. Worldwide, COVID-19 has revealed a pre-existing pandemic called poverty. As coronavirus ravages the globe, it most brutally impacts poor people and marginalized communities. Hundreds of millions of people are being pushed into poverty and unemployment, with an increase in hunger, homelessness, and dangerous work. Philip Alston, the outgoing UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, summarized this in his final report. Helping the rich getting rich in order to alleviate poverty has entirely upended the social contract and redefined the public good, he said. As a result, it has adopted, and I quote him, an agenda characterized by deregulation, privatization, lower taxes for corporations and the wealthy, easy movement of money across borders, and excessive legal protections for capital, end of quote. The result is that it enriches the wealthy while removing social welfare programs. Many of the countries that have achieved growth in the GDP following the World Bank poverty measure have also experienced rising hunger, unaffordable housing and health costs, persistent racial wealth gaps, the proliferation of jobs that don't pay a living wage, and ecological devastation. COVID-19 has also laid bare the gender gap. While job losses due to the virus has affected everybody, it has hurt women in a disproportionate manner. Around the globe, women tend to have the lowest paid jobs in our economy, and women of color in particular are overrepresented in low-wage roles. In a crisis like the one caused by COVID-19, the jobs with the lowest pay and less security are often the first ones that employers let go. To move away from the victim blaming syndrome it's necessary to focus on the structural sins that exacerbate inequalities and justify individual privilege. Naming racism, sexism, classism, and ageism as structural sin enables us to address them theologically and not only as sociological markers. When a wrong is accepted, practiced, and justified within a society, it affects everyone, but in particular, the least and the last. Structural sin is clearly manifested in the unequal access to health care in the US. In the city of Chicago, COVID-19 is battering African American communities. In spite of accounting for only 30% of the city's population, Black people make up 60% of COVID cases and have the highest mortality rate out of any racial or ethnic group. Wealth and political clout enable some to fly by helicopter to a special wing of a hospital, while others cannot even get to emergency room or a simple COVID test. The lack of access to medical treatment is a painful manifestation of structural sin. It demonstrates that there is a social dimension of sin beyond individual wrongdoing. It demonstrates that there is something has gone horribly wrong in our society when the last words of a patient dying due to COVID-19 are, "Who is going to pay for my medical bill?" The words uttered by the disciples still echo in our minds. Who sinned, this man or his parents? It is a simpler explanation to blame the victim, find fault with the ill and the dead. What did the people who are dying from complications related to COVID-19 do to bring this upon themselves? The majority for being poor, brown, and Black, for being homeless and sick, for being vulnerable. It is on these bodies that COVID-19 leaves the marks of structural sin. In this, not the blind man nor his parents, but all of us share a responsibility, not only in its causes, but also in finding solutions. We share corporate responsibility for sinful actions that originate from social systems because directly or indirectly we benefit from them. But then We must also take our collective responsibility in denouncing these injustices and inequalities, dismantling their luring rhetoric and deadly practices, in order to nurture empathy and solidarity, collective gestures of grace and exercise of justice. Then we can understand Jesus' own words in response to his disciples. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I'm the light of the world. May the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic help us shed light among us as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanda, for that presentation. I think there are some connecting points from the previous presentations of the other webinars, and we're going to pick up some of that in the conversation. The idea of COVID-19 as this revealer of a previous pandemic, poverty, and then the intersections of the structural sins as a way, as an entry point in dealing with what the issues are rather than blaming and finding fault and the victim. So thank you very much for that presentation. We're going to turn now to Tiniko, and Tiniko would be doing his paper on giving the earth a rest, preparing for a post-COVID future. Tiniko, over to you.
Well, that title was the original title of my paper. It has mutated a little bit ever since. And I've now called it A New World is Being Born, Beyond the Graveyard, the Prison, and Exile. I start my paper. If the connection is too bad, you will tell me so that maybe I just leave my voice on and switch off my video, if that will help. But I start my paper with a quotation from Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage in the 3rd century, when he said this about pestilence. And he said, "Pestilence and plagues search out the righteousness of each and every one and examines the minds of the human race." End of quote. We now know that more than 43 million people have been infected and that over 1 million have died globally. By the end of this year, South Africa will have been under COVID-19 lockdown for more than 60% of the year, 2020. Over 700,000 South Africans have been infected and more than 600,000 have recovered. The official death toll in South Africa stands at about 18,000. But there is a great deal of debate among the experts as to whether that number is really the correct one, whether everyone who died because of COVID-19 has been recorded as such in this country. And in fact, all over the continent of Africa, there is that debate. Now, I paint 3 pictures, and if you can allow me just to talk to the 3 metaphors. One I take from the Bible. The second one I take from the world of fiction. And the third one also from the world of fiction, before I try and propose not so much a solution, but complicate the picture even more before I stop. In March 2009, I did a Bible study on Mark 5, which was published in the International Review of Mission. You will recall that Mark 5 begins with the story of a man possessed with an impure spirit, depending on which version of the Bible you read. As Jesus arrived in the Gerasene region by boat, the troubled man emerges out of the graveyard and pounces. I have renamed the troubled man the graveyard man. He went running towards Jesus and knelt before him. And before the man could utter a word, Jesus had already issued a command for the impure spirit to come out of the man. But the unclean spirit inside the graveyard man responded and proceeded to conduct a curious conversation with Jesus. And so at the top of his voice, the graveyard man pleaded, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of Most High God? In God's name, please don't torture me." Now, the evangelist Mark unfolds the story quite deftly, I think. To prepare his reader for the looming drama, Mark first provides in very few words an excellent abridged CV and a vivid character mapping of the graveyard man. And I quote from Mark, "This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones." Now, at my most depressed moments of COVID-19 lockdown in South Africa, I went looking in my mind for the graveyard man of Mark 5. As I undertook the many journeys from my study to the kitchen, from the front door to the garden and back, from the bedroom to the bathroom, I sometimes took the opportunity to look into the mirror, and lo and behold, the graveyard man would stare back at me, and there was a smirk in his face. At those moments, I would feel mad in the American sense of the word, as in mad at the graveyard man for invading my home and my tormented consciousness. But I also felt mad, as in feeling like there was a loose screw in my brain, so that sometimes I felt tempted to start an argument with the jacaranda tree that sits smugly in the middle of the small garden in front of my house. At those times, I felt as if my entire country was the graveyard in which the Makan graveyard man resided. No, actually, I imagined a massive and unstoppable graveyard extending across the land, taking over the country acre by acre, 1 square kilometer at a time, like a shadow of a moving cloud. In this daytime nightmare of mine, of imagining the world and my country as a graveyard, our 4 major cities, Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, and Durban, were the epicenters from which the graveyard was daily expanding seismically across the land. Now, perhaps part of the reason I had this nightmare is because the MEC for Health in Gauteng threatened in July that he was going to build 1.5 million grave sites for what he called potential mass burials. Now, it took me some time to work out why I had this haunting sense of the Makan graveyard man, until I returned to the Bible study, which I did 10 years ago. Not being a biblical scholar, I probably was violating many hermeneutical protocols, because I read Mark 5 as if it was one story. Now, you will recall that Mark 5 consists, in fact, of 3 stories. The graveyard man, the woman with a flow of blood, and the story of Jairus, the man who went looking for Jesus because his little girl was dying. And in my reading of that story in the Bible study, I read it as if there was a competition between all 3 of them to reach Jesus. In fact, there was an actual competition between at least two of them, Jairus and the woman with a flow of blood. Now, in my reading, the graveyard man was the first one off the blocks. Now, he launched towards Jesus. You could argue that his approach to Jesus was involuntary, that it was not him, that he didn't quite know what he was doing, and that he went to Jesus perhaps to say to Jesus, please stay away from me. Now, I think he went to Jesus for help because if he really wanted peace, he could have just stayed in the comfort of living in a graveyard, which is where he actually lived. Now, imagine how from one end of the crowd that was milling around Jesus, there's a woman trying to reach to Jesus because she's got this unstoppable flow of blood. From the other end, there's this synagogue leader, Jairus, who is also going towards Jesus to beg for help for his daughter. And he reaches Jesus first, obviously, because he's a man and he could push harder through the crowd. And while Jesus is still talking to him and probably walking with him towards his house, arrives this woman who recognizes that not being a man, without a name in that story, she had to do something subversive. And she went behind Jesus, touched his garment, and stole power from him to get her healing. Now, I want to suggest that COVID-19 has put the world in that situation where we are all competing to reach out for help, to reach out for a cure, to reach out to Jesus if you want to be spiritual about it. And that the world is indeed, or has indeed become a graveyard. Certainly some countries more than others, but the entire world has been like a graveyard. And I think we are graveyard men and women ourselves, not dead yet, but close enough to the gravesite, living there, as it were. The second metaphor which I want to touch on very briefly is that of the world as a prison. And I'm jumping through many of my notes. Now, I borrowed this metaphor of the world as a prison from Ben Okri, the Nigerian writer, former Booker Prize winner with his book, The Famished Road. Last year, he published his new book, The Freedom Artist, in which he paints a picture of the world as a prison. Now, the world has been a prison in 2020. I don't think Ben Okri could have imagined that it would happen so soon, because all of us were locked in prisons. The prisons were our own homes. The prisons were our own countries within our borders. Now, in the book, The Freedom Artist, not only is the whole world a giant prison, but actually people in that world live according to the most brutal and the most ridiculous rules and regulations. Thinking is a criminal offense in that world. Books have been banned for so long that people have forgotten how to write and how to make books. Sleeping, including sleepwalking, is mandatory. So is wailing at night. People are losing their minds in that country. Those with minds to lose, that is. In this world, the rich minority lives in luxury and the poor scramble for bread in the streets. But here's the thing. Despite all these absurd and dictatorial regulations, the secretive and elusive hierarchy with a capital H, that rules that world does not allow anyone to see, depict, or name that world as a prison. Instead, the hierarchy does everything in its power, and it had all the power to suppress all propagation of past and present knowledge of the world as a prison. You can't talk about a prison in that country. The concern is that the more often the people hear about and see portrayals of the world as prison, they may realize that indeed they live in a prison. So what does the government do? It pays people to paint kinder, more generous, more gentle pictures of the world, to depict it as a garden rather than a prison. Writers, singers, and artists are encouraged to paint and produce these alternative depictions of the world. But that is just the nice side of things. On the not so nice side of things, there is a special police squad in that country, more like the special anti-robbery squad of Nigeria. This squad does not shoot people down when they protest. No, consists of cannibals. The police actually eat up the people. So that in that world, you meet many people with missing limbs, no ear, no eye, half a lip gone, because they had been eaten off, beaten off by the cannibalistic police. Now, I don't think Ben Okri knew that SARS was about to happen in Nigeria. He also didn't know that George Floyd would be killed by the police during COVID-19, nor that 11 South Africans would be killed, one of whom was dragged out of his own house to be killed by the police. But that's the picture. Did we or did we not live in a prison? Are we not in a prison now? And the final one, and if I'm running out of my time, I'll stop because I can take some of these issues during discussions, is to go back to Albert Camus's La Peste, the plague in English. Now, this novel of Albert Camus was, of course, located in Algeria, the country of his birth, in the city of Oran. There's something about Algeria, because Albert Camus was born there. Jacques Derrida, I think, was also born there. And Frantz Fanon lived there, even though he wasn't born there, was naturalized there. Now, this book is, of course, old now. It was written in 1947 when Camus was 34 years old. I just have a sense that he captures something that only fiction writers can capture. As Zakes Mda, the South African author, says, journalists and historians ask the question, what happened? But fiction writers ask the question, what does it feel like to be in what happened? And I think that is what Camus manages in that novel, which many of you, I'm sure, you have read. The people of Oran, that coastal city in Algeria, were taken by surprise when the Bubonic Plague hit their town. First, they saw rats dying, then human beings started to die in their numbers. And of course, what Camus confronts is the tragedy of human living and human dying in the face of a pandemic. And some of his descriptions of dead bodies and mass burials were particularly visceral and very difficult to handle. In many ways, we saw glimpses of this during this year. Now,
Okay.
to conclude.
Diego, if you could wrap it up quick, yeah.
Okay, let me just wrap it up quickly then in 1 minute.
Yeah.
Because as I say, I can come back to these issues.
Yes.
South Africa, in 300 years, South Africa has had 5 epidemics. And if South Africa was a microcosm of the world, I think the way South Africa has responded to the epidemics is the way the world is likely to respond. So South Africa had smallpox, bubonic plague, polio, HIV/AIDS, and now COVID-19. Apartheid, as we have come to know it in South Africa, is the most original response to the epidemic. The first separation of people and the creation of so-called locations in South Africa was a response to a pandemic, to the bubonic plague in particular. And of course, when influenza came in 1918, it was the first time the government thought of building houses for white people. So I argue that there's a disruption that comes with a pandemic, but the disruption is hardly ever the kind that comes in the shape of Luke 4, verse 18. COVID-19, it's not good news to the poor. And it's likely to be good news to the poor even this time around. I'll stop.
Thank you, Tinuka. We'll come back to it because I think you have nailed an interesting naming of graveyard and playing with graveyard and gardening. And what came to my mind from this idea of gardening is what the former Barbadian poet George Lamming, in his book In the Castle of My Skin, begins by saying, "High on the hill are the landlord's house and garden surrounded by a brick wall." And it was picked up by another writer from the Caribbean, a poet by the name of Olive Senior, who wrote Gardening in the Tropics and had a couple of lines this way: "Gardening in the tropics, you never know what you'll turn up, quite often bones." So it's part of that colonial project. So the sort of pandemic which has been endemic. Thank you for that contribution. And we'll come back and have that discussion. Anthony, if I can bring you in for you to briefly reflect on the presentation you have given earlier and to do so around why we need to resist returning to the old normal.
Indeed. Well, it's a great honor to be back here again. And much like I did this morning, I will not be talking directly to the paper that I've written. I will amplify that and perhaps use it as an opportunity to reflect very quickly on some of the things that didn't get into paper because of constraints of space. I want to start with some comments that are reputed to have been made by the President of the United States in 1920. That was a guy called Warren Harding. So it was a president, is a president that followed Woodrow Wilson. And in an early interview after his inauguration, he was asked about his Christian faith and why he was a Christian. And he's reputed to have said that he saw his Christian faith as being entirely consistent with the lifestyle of America and business of America, and particularly of capitalism. When pushed further, he then pointed to what he believed was his favorite biblical text, which was the parable of the talents, Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. And Harding cited that as being evidence that Christianity and capitalism were entirely synonymous one with another because they had very, very similar virtues and values. And he pointed therefore to America as a Christian nation under God. And it seems to me that actually thinking of that particular biblical text, and I know that in our audience, that we have a number of very eminent scholars, so I'll be interested in their reflections on this particular text. But it actually seems to me that text, in many respects, in terms of both a normative reading of it and then a post-colonial reading of it in terms of resistance, for me points to itself as a microcosm for actually the larger ideological battles that are presently at play in terms of this particular moment around COVID-19. I think one of the things I want to say about why we need to resist going back to the old normal is because the old normal was, I believe, fundamentally a distorted idolatrous system. And a distorted idolatrous system because what we had been taught for many years, particularly with the collapse of communism in the Eastern Bloc, was that what we were seeing in terms of the ultimate triumph of global capitalism was this sense in which this was clearly normative of God and therefore normative of God's economy, what we sometimes call the kingdom of God. And it seems to me that part of resisting going back to the old normal is the need to resist this dangerous conflation that has existed for, I would say, for about 1,500 years now, which is the conflation of empire and imperial aggrandizement with Christianity and the church, that has then morphed into global capitalism, in which we have been taught to believe that the present world order is somehow synonymous with God's economy. And this is normative for how we understand God's interactions with human beings and with the world as we experience it. And therefore, that sense of resistance is necessary for the church to be authentically the church in terms of one that is committed to liberative praxis, and that sense in which it's good news for the poor and the preferential option for the poor and the marginalized is realized, rather than what we've often seen, which is a preferential option for the rich and the powerful, with the poor being the token mateweights in order to sustain a system that was never created with them in mind at all. Significant to this, and I think I would imagine that many others have said this in previous panels. I've only been able to join us today, so I'm not aware of what others have said on previous days. But I think central to this has to be a critical rereading of the biblical tradition, recognizing that in many respects, and I think Gerald West has said this to me in a previous session, about recognizing the problem of Scripture itself and the way in which it then becomes this imprimatur for giving permission to certain types of oppressive and idolatrous regimes under the aegis of the name of God. I think one of the clear things that we have to try and do in this new normal, this moment of resistance, this kairos moment of trying to resist the old imperialism, and the imperialism also monopoly global capitalism, is this separation from a broader biblical tradition and I guess corporate Christianity is somehow being so synonymous with God that this is what God wants. I think we have to make that clear distinction and say actually that the God of justice and liberation, who is represented in Jesus, is not the God of global monopoly capitalism, is not the God of the present world order that we have been encouraged to see and perceive as being synonymous with the kingdom. It's very interesting that on a normative reading, that the one I guess that many of us have grown up with in church, and certainly the one that Warren Harding was very, very happy to quote as being synonymous with Scripture, has been synonymous with God and capitalism, that what we have is a story where a cruel master is purported to be God. And the villain of the piece, who's the third one, is the one who is condemned to punishment, which is wholly disproportionate to the fact that his only crime is simply not to make a profit for a master who acknowledges that he is rapacious and cruel, and certainly is not a just master. And yet somehow, through a sleight of hand of empire, we've all been encouraged to read this as somehow being synonymous with God's economy, that this is how God treats us. And even when I was a child growing up in Sunday school in a very conservative evangelical Methodist church, the one thing that stuck out like a sore thumb, even when I was a kid, was the bit, actually right at the end of the text, where it says, "For those who have much, more will be given to them. And for those who have little, even the little they have will be taken from them." And yet somehow all of us have been taught to read that as somehow being synonymous with God. Well, actually, in many respects, that is the God of global monopoly capitalism. If we are taking the old normal as being normative of God's economy, then indeed that was absolutely true. That actually those who have more will be given to them, and the little that the majority have, even that will be taken from them. That is a very accurate reading if one takes it as a normative stance. I certainly want to argue that that is not the normative stance from a liberative and post-colonial perspective. And therefore, a way of resisting, well, the reason for resisting going back to the old normal, I want to predicate upon three points very quickly. First is a resistance I guess that's a global capitalism. Second is a resistance to hegemonic whiteness that has actually patrolled and controlled those forces for the last 5 centuries. And then thirdly, therefore, it's a theological deconstruction of the normativity of ways of reading scripture that are intent upon reinforcing injustice against the majority of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Brilliant, colleagues. Dinico, Wanda, Anthony, thank you very much. It was quite interesting listening to the connecting points, and I'm sure you have picked up your connecting points in terms of, hey, I never thought of that. That's an interesting bit about that graveyard methodology. I mean, poverty as this kind of graveyard, and a good imagery to reflect on impoverishment and the kind of things that happen as a result of impoverishment. And the linking with, I mean, Anthony's point there that a critical reading of scripture and Tiniako's point about, I'm going to use one example from the Bible, one from fiction, and another one from fiction. And then it suddenly struck me, what really is fiction? Is the Bible fiction, or is fiction the Bible? So that, I think, is an interesting conversation point that we can contemplate on. But I think as we start our conversation now, let's hear from the three of you in terms of what are the things you're connecting with, what is challenging you, what affirms, and this is the direction you think that we should be going. Wanda, would you like to begin?
Yes, I can start. First of all, thank you so much to Nico and Anthony for your insightful, wise, challenging contributions. I think it really resonates also with my own ideas. I want to pull two particular threads, and I think from that we can also broaden the conversation. The first one comes from Anthony's presentation, and he denounces the conflation of empire with the empirical aggrandizement of Christianity. And I think that is a reality that we have been particularly confronted during COVID-19 times, which is what are the responses of churches, and particularly what has been the stance or the lack of empathy of Christians in relationship to people who are most affected, who are more vulnerable in this. And I think it really, among the many pandemics that have been exposed in this particular one, has been the ill effects of a theology of retribution, and how this conflation between empire and the aggrandizement of Christianity has led to a prosperity theology that really taps into what are some of the most, I would say, death-affirming consequences of empire. And I want to just quote Patrick Blanchfield, who was doing some analysis about reactions to the pandemic, and he goes back to the early Puritans and looking at epidemics and seeing them as a divine dispensation. And so he wrote, and I quote, "The very fact that people are dying is taken as both pragmatically offering market opportunities, but also a theological vindication of our own survivorship." Meaning to say, you really blame the victims and you find fault in their actions so that you are exempt from standing in solidarity with. And I think that truth has been laid bare. The second aspect, the second thread that I want to draw from Tiniko's presentation is the use, the interpretation of Mark 5 as being a competition among the people who are seeking help, healing, and health. So looking for help, healing, and health in this context of prosperity theology means that there is a growth, and especially speaking from the Brazilian context, in which illness, suffering is seen as punishment and oftentimes as synonymous with evil itself. And so, again, blaming the one who is the victim for not doing enough to be able to afford or receive the merit of health, healing, and well-being, bodily well-being. And I think these two threads lead us to a wider question about the acceptable sacrifices that now are seen as some people are more exposed to the virus, but then it's also seen as it's their lack of merit, and some folks then are more expendable. Some lives are worth less, and that's what the lack of Christian ethos has produced also among ourselves. Thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank you, Wanda. I think it's the African philosopher Membe, if I pronounce it properly, speaks of necropolitics. You know, the whole idea of how a state then organizes who are the people who are expendable, and around that. So that's a thread that has been running through all of the conversation thus far. So I want to go to Tinoko, if you can make a contribution now in terms of what you've heard and some of the connecting points.
From Wanda's presentation, blaming, I couldn't agree more with the idea of blaming the victim. But what we have seen in South Africa in 300 years of epidemics and pandemics, in my view, is not merely blaming the individual victim, but the blaming of groups of people. So, for example, when smallpox broke out in the 1700s, it coincided with the colonial wars of resistance. And so as the Khoi died off in large numbers, and one of the consequences of smallpox is that you became infertile once affected by it, and their numbers dwindled. It was a blessing in disguise for the colonialists, because this disease was doing for them what would have taken longer for them to do manually, as it were. And so when the Bubonic Plague came up in South Africa, the colored or so-called mixed race people, African people, Indian people were moved out of Cape Town because they were supposed to be the carriers of this, because they were dirty and they lived in slum areas. They were moved out of District 6. That was actually the first moving out of people or out of District 6. In Johannesburg, when the Bubonic Plague hit Johannesburg, Cooley Township, which was a township where you had Indians, Africans, and people of mixed race, was razed to the ground. And the authorities moved everyone to Klipspruit, which later on became Pimville, which later on became Soweto. So the idea of apartheid was born in response to the pandemic. So it's not just blaming the individual victim, it was blaming a whole group of people. These people, the Africans, the hordes of blacks, are the ones with the problem. And so let's rid the city of these people. The only other point I want to make, so this idea of prosperity, gospel, theology of retribution, I say yes and no to that, because Gerald was talking.
Tineko, can you turn off your...
Sometimes when the poor and
Maybe you should turn off your camera and speak.
Okay. All right. Sometimes when the poor and marginalized people are put under so and they are losing everything that they have, they are losing their health, they are losing lives. Sometimes what you have are millenarian reactions. So you had Enoch Mgijima, this guy who in the 1900s set off and took his group of people to a mountain. And they were, of course, massacred by the police. There's this young woman called Nonte Tankwenkwe who contracted influenza and lost her mind a little bit and ends up starting a church. So I think we must be careful not to lump everyone into this of prosperity theologies, because sometimes it is people really battling with existential realities. The empire is eating them away, and so is the disease, and so are other things, and they have to find a way of responding to that situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tinuku. Anthony, I'll give Anthony a chance also to make connections, and then I'll come to other members on the panel here before we receive any question from the attendees. Anthony?
Yeah, indeed, yes. I think the connection I find between Wanda and Tinyika and myself, I think are around sort of theologies of competition. That I think in both, I think in sort of Tinyika's reading of the Martin text, and then obviously in Vanda's sort of reflection, I think both in North America and Brazil, I think what you have is the way in which I think empire tries to create scarceness, and therefore that scarcity then gets played out in theologies of competition, in which the scramble for resources, or whether the scramble for God's even God's attention. So God as a primary subject isn't gracious and generous. God is either a retributive God or a God that works on the basis of what elsewhere I've spoken about as a contractual compassion. So God will love those who deserve to be loved, and those who are being seen as transgressive or problematic, then clearly it's their fault, and God is not responding to their agency. And so I think we have to be very clear about the ways in which sometimes theology itself is culpable of being manipulated by empire in order, as Wanda said, I think, to categorize particular individuals, and also, as Tinyika said, to categorize particular communities as being the problem. So it's never the system that's a problem, because by definition, the system that is empire is good and is of God. So if it's not working for particular groups or individuals, it's somehow their faults. And the theology of competition then, I think, then helps to legitimize that particular process.
Thank you, Anthony. Can I go to Kuzipa and Gerald and then Benny? I mean, I just went in that order, but any colleague can indicate to me that you want to make a contribution to this one. Benny? Kuzipa?
I think let Benny go first.
I have several questions as ways to complicate the picture, so I'm just going to say the questions. The first one is about Mark chapter 5. So Wanda talks about blaming the victim, but I want to ask about shifting the injury. So previous panelists have talked about ecological concerns. So what about the pigs in Mark chapter 5? How do we read that? Is there a different way to read that particular story? The second question has to do with Tiniko's question about the world as a prison. So there are also people both in the US and in Europe. I'm less familiar with other regions of the world, but I don't think that's happening in Asia. In the US and in Europe, there are people who refuse to wear a mask because I think Wanda mentioned this, right? That they are against public policy as religious persecution. But some of them are also simply saying that as a limitation of freedom. So how does that jive with what Tinika was talking about, the world as prison? I also want to say that this question relates to what Anthony talks about. I actually don't think the powers that we have to confront are happy to return to the old normal either. I think they're actually pushing something new with this kind of freedom that should be against any kind of regulation, any kind of public policy. My last question also have to do with Nico's reading of Mark 5 as a whole. I think actually that's wonderful. But I don't think the question really is all of us looking for a cure of COVID. I think the competition that he points to and Anthony also just referred to actually is we have multiple global needs looking for healing. So 2020 exposed the problem is really not just COVID, although most of us are focusing on it. I think Volker pointed that out in his presentation when he ended by saying there are all kinds of things that are shaking our planet. Colonialism, poverty, ecological disaster, just to name a few. So how do you deal with all these competing needs when the tendency is to say we have to solve the COVID problem first? So those are my three questions.
Thank you, Benny. That's heavy questions as usual. But I think I like how you came back on the one because you did mention that earlier about is it cure or is it healing? And I think that that's an interesting point to reflect on. So I'll go to Kazipa and then I ask the contributors to please note, so because I'm going to come back for some responses. And Gerald, if you also would like to say something and the colleagues would respond. Kazipa?
Yeah. Thank you very much to the presenters. I think, in my view, I hear an echo once again from the previous presentations. I remember Anna's presentation about ambiguity of the church's place, in all this, that we're reflecting on. I have a question for Tiniko. Let the Earth Rest was the initial title. What happened to the Earth in the current reflection would be my question. The third thing I'd like to say is how, through the presentations that have been made, I hear, structural sin quite strongly again, and I hear the need to be receptive to beyond, the classic sources, for theology, and I find that very helpful. And my question arising from that, mainly to Anthony, is when we give the historical critique of liberation theologies and all that, how much of the critique has taken effect, and is there an accounting for, something other than, the effects of empire, but a certain hybridity in terms of, interaction, the middle point, through the journey?
Thank you, Kazipa. Gerald, would you, before I turn to the colleagues, and then Sione would come after colleagues responded.
Okay, Michael, thank you, and thank you to the three presenters. It was great to see the connections there and the resonances with what's happened in other sessions. What struck me was the way in which each of you was grappling with scripture, with biblical texts, and what I would like to ask is how we communicate, particularly to church leaders, that what we are offering in our different readings of these texts is not a definitive singular voice, but we are trying to tease out a voice over against other voices in the text. And I think that, liberation theology in the 70s and 80s made the mistake, South African contextual theology made the mistake of arguing that the Bible had a prophetic voice, as if it didn't have any other voice. And it took a long time for Latin American liberation theology to acknowledge that there was an ominous voice, voices in the Bible. And we had to turn to feminist theologies and South African Black theology, for example, to identify this, that the Bible itself was a site of struggle, these different voices competing and contending with each other. How do we offer that as a resource to our churches? In my own experience, in the work with the Ujamaa Center, ordinary people don't have a problem with this. They know the Bible's got more than one voice. That's their experience of the Bible. It's the gatekeepers who are the clergy, the pastors, the priests, who in order to show their control of Scripture, represented as having a singular voice, even if it is a prophetic voice. How do we grapple with that?
Thank you, Gerald. Colleagues, please, who would want to respond to these questions, these conversation points? Who would like to begin?
Maybe I should.
Okay, Tiniko.
This is Tiniko, yeah. So, yeah, the question of the search for a cure, is it a search for a cure or is it a search for healing? Of course, it is a search for healing. But the USA under Donald Trump is not looking for healing. They are looking to be the first one to get the vaccine. Russia is not looking for healing. They are looking to be the ones who get the vaccine. There is a competition out there to get a vaccine, and as far as they are concerned, that is a cure. It's a silver bullet that will make money and hopefully also deal with the virus. So I am fully aware of the need to talk of healing instead of a cure, but in the real world, the competition is not really for healing. It is for dominance, for what earlier on we were talking about, for a world in which we are not vulnerable. That's what we're looking for. So I was also looking at the three people trying to reach out to Jesus as some kind of competition between them. But this is probably not necessarily a bad kind of competition because they are looking for wholeness, and I suppose that is where we should be turning to talk about wholeness. The pigs, yeah, I mean that's a very problematic aspect of this passage. As Gerald says, these passages give us many voices and many ways of it's a particular view of the world in which the pigs did not matter as much as that man. But I mean, it's a very truncated, it's a very one-sided view. And so we have an opportunity to grapple with Scripture and, if you like, to read against it, as it were, when it comes to that. Now, what happened to the earth, asks Kuzipa. I was hoping that nobody would ask me that question. Now, this is what happened to the earth. The earth became a prison. The earth became a graveyard. The earth became Oran, that city that Albert Camus described so vividly in his novel. That is what has happened to the earth. So the prison and the graveyard are not countries. If you read Ben Okri, he's not talking about any particular country. He's talking about a whole universe, which is becoming that. And I think the challenge is how to change this situation in which the whole world is being made a prison. The whole world is being made a graveyard. How to move away from that. And the idea of giving it a rest came a little bit from that. Let me stop there for now. Sorry, just one more thing. So when this young woman called Nonteta Nkwe, who, when she recovered from influenza, started seeing visions. And one of the visions she saw was that the poor and the marginalized, the Black people ought to, if the empire is going to be defeated, and that they should stop focusing on white people. It's quite amazing. And of course, what the authorities did was to declare her mad. They said, this woman is mad, she's out of her mind, and they diagnosed her with some kind of schizophrenia and sentenced her to life in a mental asylum where she died. So the question of mental health also, I think, is another one that I think becomes very important at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tinyepe. So Wanda and Anthony, we have some minutes left before we have to go to Sione. So your responses, please.
You want to go first, Anthony?
Yeah, I don't mind. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in that I think the question posed by Kuzipa is in many respects actually answered very, very well actually by Gerald. So I will probably, as I put those two questions in against each other, and then I'll sort of duck out of the middle, because I think what the question posed by Kuzipa really was about this question about what has liberation theology learned. And I think what it has learned has been very much, I think, the insights that someone like Gerald and other people have brought around, I think, the importance of sort of vernacular hermeneutics. Because I think the problem with liberation theology was that it was sort of trying to replace one monolithic system actually with another one. I mean, it was well-meaning, but essentially it was trying to create an alternative authority. But I think, as we have seen, that authority was untenable because there are a variety of voices within Scripture, and therefore to suggest that on the basis of the biblical text alone that God is a God of liberation, well, that is not borne out by all the multiple perspectives of God that are presented within that contestation. So I think in order to move beyond that, I think it's also then about actually listening to the poor rather than having the poor as an icon. And therefore, I think that then means that there is, I think, within kind of post-colonial and sort of vernacular hermeneutics, I think a certain level of ambiguity that to say actually that we live in a world of contestation, and part of that messiness is what ordinary people, I think, frequently live with, where they know that actually there are times where God's silence is utterly perplexing. And it's very difficult, I think, to pin God down. And therefore, I think that's where I think some of the flexibility and creativity, I think, actually comes from in terms of the agency of ordinary poor people. I think where I would differ with Gerald is, and maybe I'm just too pessimistic, I have given up sort of trying to talk to authority figures around how they can engage with this, because quite frankly, they don't want to. It's not in their best interests in order to do that. So therefore, I think what one can learn from Latin America is about grassroots communities who are empowered to read it for themselves and just let them get on with it. Because actually, agency and transformation will always be a bottom-up, not a top-down exercise.
Thank you, Anthony. Wanda, and
Yes, well, thank you so much for the insights and for the food for thought. One of the things I like about how many of you started by saying that you wanted to complicate things more. The etymology of the word complicate means complicare, and complicare means with folds. And so every new contribution really helped to open up a new set of perspectives and insights. And I think that is what COVID also has done, is to complicate by exposing further. And for us to see some of these interconnections. in looking at the reality of Latin America, the fastest growing religious experience is in fact that of prosperity theology. And so if you put side by side that it's also the place, the birthplace of liberation theology, there are a lot of additional queries to be posed precisely in this context. Because whereas liberation theology made an option for the poor seem to have made an option elsewhere. And I think that's also part of the conversation. And going back to the question, are we then blaming all of prosperity theology? That's not the case. I think there is an element that needs to be taken into consideration, which is that of whenever we think that grace is a matter of competition, I think we have really understood Christianity in an erroneous manner. And coming from a perspective of grace and not of competition also leads us into seeing suffering not as a punishment, but suffering as a place to encounter the divine. And I think that's an element that we could all agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wanda. Sione, we haven't heard from you. You have been harvesting iDays or not? Or is there a contribution I'd like to make at this point? Before I go back to something that Benny has said, and then we'll turn to Karen Georgia.
Thank you. A question just came up on the Q&A, but I'll respond to it. I'm just following up an invitation earlier in the previous session. Let's meet outside. This is a graveyard scene from my context. This graveyard did not get up and walk into the sea. We have legends of graveyards walking into the sea and walking out of the sea. But this is the graveyard. This is part of the graveyard. So how do we deal with this reality? Thank you.
I was going to say leave it. Thanks very much, Sione, because you don't need words with that, because it presses home the point and the urgency and what is the task before us, which then brings me back to something that Benny had mentioned, which actually caught my attention in the sense of, is it the case that empire wants the old normal? And whether empire isn't looking for something else, and whether empire would find ingenious ways of its own avatars, however it names the avatars. So I think that's an interesting point to reflect on. So Benny, I don't know, you just mentioned it, but is there some other thought in your mind around that you'd like to share at this point? Or you just posed it that as something that suddenly struck you?
No, I think actually I know the context of the U.S. best, so my comment has to be limited to the situation in the U.S. I do think that the degree and also the kind seem to be very different now with how the Supreme Court is being lined up and how the white Christian nationalism is really explicit. So I actually don't think they want the old normal either. They want something that's even much more extreme. It's almost kind of like a theocracy that is going to be formed. So actually, it is quite alarming, in my opinion.
Thank you, Benny. That's helpful. Thank you very much. Colleagues, thanks very much for your contributions, for your input. We are indeed, grateful for all the conversation points, your time, your commitment, and the ways in which you've engaged over the length of time that we have had these webinars to follow and to ask questions and to also to get us thinking. So thank you very much. And we also like to thank all of our attendees, those who have followed, those who have dipped in and out, and those who have followed us not only through Zoom, but on Facebook. We are indeed grateful. There is still one more webinar to come up, and depending on your time zone, I wouldn't dare to say whether it's going to be, in my context, it's going to be 12 midnight onto a new day. So whatever the time is in your context, please note it's on art and the pandemic, and it's located in the Caribbean and Americas region. So we would encourage, if you're available, to join that. If not, we do understand, because it would be recorded and it would be on Facebook. And to also remind us that there is this questionnaire that would pop up at the end of after our benediction, and we'll ask those who are invited to answer it. Please complete it, because it helps us to manage future gatherings of this nature. So again, thank you very much. And I'll now turn to our colleague, the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia, who would do our poetic benediction at this time.
Good afternoon from the United States, where the time changed last night, with my apologies for being a little bit late. Today's poetic rendering is called New Hope. Blaming the victim, blaming groups of people who are unwell, empire eating the people away, disease eating away the lives of God's people. In the midst, what do we have to say? God's silence is perplexing, disease a mystery to be solved, requiring intervention of a divine presence. Where is God in the midst of the messy complications of pandemic and propensity to oppress the poor? Safety of the world arbitrarily rendered, refusals to support the lives and living of the masses. Masks pushed aside as illegitimate response, competing needs interrupting the possibilities of healing. Where to lay the blame as the suffering increases, where to find answers that includes a God of grace, where to place our hope in these days of death when graveyards are walking into the seas. A scramble for good life, destruction of abundant living, fighting for attention from a God co-opted, culpable religion supporting gods of capitalism, oppression itself named God. The earth begs rest in an unforeseeable future where empires toppled and nation states grapple with diminishing resources, the opportunity to heal the masses confused with the search for a cure. The competition identifies a price at the end, a capitalist need for empire to once again exhibit dominance, increase revenue at the price of those in need, teetering on the margins. Competition that defies the cry for help, blaming those who are impacted by disease. Here, in a race for millions at stake, the world becomes smaller, the earth a prison turned graveyard. Borders become prison walls, boundaries mark graves. Visions needed to tear down these walls, vision for healing a world diagnosed with apathy and incompassionate malaise. Learning escapes the masses, signs point to need for change, systems begging for alternatives. Where is the liberation of God promised in a state of life where capitalism still prospers? The silence drives us into deeper necropolitics. The margins refuse the return to normal. Emerging are new ways for living this life. Emerging is the fight for new life. Life for the poor, life for the unwell, new life, new hope, new freedoms.